topic for my discussion is the language of paradox. I'll be discussing on the language of paradox. So first, who has written it? The language of paradox was written by Cleanth Brooks. The language of paradox was written by Cleanth Brooks. Okay. He was an influential American literary critic and professor. Cleanth Brooks, an eminent new critic who publicly supported the centrality of paradox as a way of understanding and interpreting poetry. Now let's see what paradox is. In a simple language, paradox is an idea or a statement that seems wrong or impossible but actually makes sense once given a deeper thought and analysis into it. Okay, अगर हम लोग हिंदी में समझे तो it's a idea or a statement when you read one line and you do not, तुम एक जब लाइन पढ़ते हो and तुम लोग उसको समझ नहीं पाते वो आइडिया क्या है, लेकिन जब वो पोएम है, मान लो फॉर एग्जांपल इट्स अ पोएम, तो उसके आगे आगे जब तुम लोग पढ़ते हो तो तुम लोग को पता चलेगा अच्छा हाँ ये लाइन मतलब वो था, मतलब ये जो सेंस है, ये जो थिंग है कि बाद में तुम्हें पता चलता है, वंस यू गिव अ डीपर थॉट इनटू इट, वो होता है, दैट इज़ व्हाट इज़ नोन एज पैराडॉक्स. ओके, सो हम यहाँ पार्ट वाइज पढ़ेंगे. आई एम नॉट गोइंग इन डिटेल. सो फर्स्ट लेट्स सी व्हाट इज़ पैराडॉक्स इन लिटरेचर. So in literature, paradox is a statement or a pair of statements or even the exploration of an idea that seems contradictory. Contradictory is or opposing upon its first glance. This idea will force the reader to take a deeper look in order to fully understand the meaning. This might be done to provoke active reading or discussions or just a deeper thought about the topic. Once you see, once you read, once you are going to read it, and if you feel like it's difficult to understand, this paradox in literature simply states that this can evoke or provoke your active reading. Okay, you will do discussions or just deeper thought about the topic. A paradox might be used to show humor or satire or a wit. Paradox in poetry. So, in poetry, paradox is a key to express tensions and thus becomes a central device to convey its meaning. As the word paradox, it's a Greek word which means it's a Greek word which has literary origin, which literally means beyond belief. Okay. So, paradox is a Greek word which means beyond belief. Okay, paradox is a Greek word. So, an element of paradox in poetry functions to give focus on the meaning of a word or a situation beyond what it first appears to be. It's exactly the same meaning. Next is the language of paradox lays out Brooks' argument for the centrality of paradox by demonstrating that paradox is, what is paradox? That what it demonstrates the paradox is the language appropriate and inevitable to poetry. Okay, to poetry, it's why. Okay, so in this essay, Cleanth emphasizes on how the language of poetry is different from that of science, or how the scientific language because the poet constructs this language as he goes and defines his own rules. Many of us consider paradox as an intellectual, clever and rational. We consider paradox as intellectual, clever, and rational. Okay, but rather than what it should be considered, rather than emotional, profound, and irrational. In short, paradox is a language of reason other than emotion. Okay. Paradox is a or the language of reason rather than emotion. Brooks has also given examples or taken examples from William Wordsworth's sonnet, many others. So let's start with William Wordsworth's sonnet. The name of the sonnet was "It is a Beauteous Evening." It is a beauteous evening, calm and free. Okay, it was a poem. It was a sonnet written by William Wordsworth. He begins by outlining the initials and surface conflict, which is that the speaker is filled with worship while his female companion does not seem to be. Here, the paradox is discovered by the poem's end is that the girl is more full of worship than the speaker. Because why is it so? Because she is always consumed with sympathy for the nature and not as in the speaker, as the speaker is in tune with the nature. The poet is conscious of whatever is grand and solemn. Okay, this is one example which has Brooks has pointed out from the William Wordsworth sonnet. It is a beauteous evening, calm and free. Next, there is another poem composed upon Westminster's Bridge. Composed upon Okay, this is another poem by William Wordsworth which Brooks point out as an example. In this poem, this poem draws the beauty from the atmosphere presented by the city early in the morning. The reader is prompted to inquire as to from where does the poem get its power. The poet finds it strange as that the man-made city in which the poet had lived for years could be so beautiful. The power of the poem is derived from the paradoxical situation that London is a part of man-made nature and hence it has got its own beauty. So, the poet considers the city to be organic and not mechanical as he had thought it before. Brooks says that the poem offers paradox not in detail but in the situation which the speaker creates. Though London is a man-made marvel and in many respects is opposition to nature, the poet now does not view London as a mechanical and artificial landscape but as a landscape comprised entirely of nature. Since London was created by man and man is a part of nature, London is thus the part of nature too. Brooks points out that the poet can call the house sleeping rather than dead. Thus, the poem captures the paradox between mechanical, cultivated city of London and the way it seems organic and alive before the eyes of the poet. Even if you all haven't understood, let me just state the difference between the two poets and make you understand it clearly. That Brooks has taken two poems of William Wordsworth First one is sonnet, which is it is a beauteous evening, calm and free. In that the poet talks about in that the speaker or the poet writes that there are two persons present in that poem. First one is the speaker, and second one is the speaker's lover, okay, or the girl. So here it's shown that the speaker is more filled with worship for nature than the female companion. Okay, he is devoted to nature, he is in tune with nature. But later on, as you will read the poem, you will discover that the girl or the female companion is more consumed with the nature. Okay, she has sympathy for nature and is more attached to it. Okay, but the difference is she doesn't shows much. Okay, but inside she cares for the nature. Okay, here's the difference, here's the paradox, that we come to find that the girl also has sympathy for nature. In the next poem, composed upon Westminster's Bridge, here Brooks points out the paradox, which is the speaker here the city which is talked about is London, and the speaker or the writer William Wordsworth says that London is so beautiful. He didn't knew London is so beautiful after living in London for so many years. One morning he was tired, he got up and he looked at the beautiness of London. Okay, the power of the poem, the power of London. Here he states that though London is a man-made, though London is a city which is made by man, okay, man-made city, but hence it can be called as a natural city. Okay, na? Why? Because what he thinks or what he states here is, though London is a man-made marvel in many aspects, which is of course opposite to nature. Okay, but the poet doesn't view London as a mechanical or artificial landscape. Okay, what he thinks is London is a man-made city and man is from nature. So in some or other way, London is a part of nature too. Okay, he thinks that like that, and here the paradoxical situation is that the London is a man-made nature. Okay, these are the two poems. Next is Brooks turns into 18th century poetry, which was considered to be the age of reason. REASON. 18th century means something in 70s. Okay, S, this is S, something in 70s. So at that point of time it was the age of reason, hence the language was paradoxic. Brooks points out few lines from the Alexander's Pope's The Essay on Man. Okay, there, and says that here the paradox insists on the irony rather than the wonder. Brooks says that language is paradoxical because there is wonder in Pope's lines and there is also underlined irony in Wordsworth's sonnet. To reinforce his argument, to give stress to his argument, Brooks cites the case of Blake and also the Coleridge, where irony and wonder merged on many occasions. That is the thing. Here it's presented that paradox insists on irony rather than wonder, rather than the fantasy things. Now we come to the language of science and poet. The paradox springs from the language where the connotation plays an important part as denotation. A scientist uses rotation to reinforce his theory, whereas the poet, on the other hand, makes up the language as the poem progresses. In science, terms need to be stabilized, but in poetry, it contrasts the purpose of the poet. Okay, so here simply it means to say that in poems you can also write the sky is pink. There's no restrictions to it, but in science, scientific terms or language has to be stabilized. The method of art can never be direct. There's a point. Art can never be direct. Okay. So it is always indirect. Brooke dismisses the claim of Mr. Swart Chase, who demanded that dissertation should be avoided in language and to treat language like notation. Brooks, he believed that paradox is like those dissertations that cannot be separated from poetry. That apparent dissertation is not actually a preservation of poetry but rather than an extension of its meaning. To reinforce his argument, Brooks refers to John Donne's poem. Here is next one more example, which is the colonization. See, canonization. And canonization. It's written by John Donne. Okay, so in which uses a paradox as its underlining metaphor. Critics have felt that John Donne resorts to sterling imagery to prove his points, or he is not serious about sainthood. But Brooks defends John. He says that using a charged religious term to describe a speaker's physical love and sanity, Donne effectively drugs that in rejecting the material world and withdrawing to a world of each other, two lovers are appropriate candidates for colonization. If you haven't read the poem Canonization, it says about the two lovers which ran away from the world, from this world to another world, the world of their own. They created their own world of love. There's a conflict between the world outside and the world of lovers runs through in the poem. The poet and his beloved, they renounce the real world which would have achieved a more tense world of their own. This seems a parody, yani ki intimate both love and religion, but in fact it combines them, pairing unlikely circumstances and demonstrating their resulting complex meaning. Brooks also points to the secondary paradox in this poem, which is simultaneous duality and singleness of love. Simultaneous duality and singleness of love. And the double and contradictory meaning of die in metaphysical poetry. He contends that these several meanings are impossible to convey at the right depth and emotions in any language but that of paradox. John Donne's the tone of the poem from the initial irritation and switches the tone of the poem. The initial tone of the poem was irritation, but he switches the tone by analyzing the love metaphor. The last image of the poem in the metaphor of the phoenix who is born out of his own ashes. The tone of the poem shifted from irony, banter into the defiant but controlled tenderness. From irony to tenderness. The reunion of the world is complete with the death of their present selves, and the lovers are new like hermits who are, after announcing the real world, would find more intense and more meaningful world. The final tone of the poem is one of the triumphant, yani ki victorious achievement. Okay, at last the lovers are achieved, or they went to their destination. So here John Donne has used many images. Some of the critics, they criticize him for using these images, but the Brooks, what he does, he defends John, and there is no harm in using the images, okay, if ever these are not satirizing the religious things, okay, they are not actually ठीक है ना. Though so the critics have felt that John Donne resorts to startling images. He uses images to prove his point, or he is not serious about his sainthood. This is what critics used to say, but Brooks defends Donne, okay. And all of these things written here are about his poem canonization. So, the sense in which the lovers become one is in a sense of the soul being united with God. We say that the sense in which the lovers becomes one is in a sense that the souls being united with God. It is when not from paradox, Donne's poem which would rather come across as not taking love seriously or not taking religious seriously in a very strong sense. Since the poem does neither, Brooks concludes that Donne is able to use the discordant or we can say disagreeing image of two lovers giving up the physical world for their love and through their sacrifice achieving the sainthood only because of the paradox that the imagery in their love and that part of their religion generals. However, there is another name used here in this poem, which is of William Ronnie. Okay, he criticizes the ways Brooks connects these poetic paradox to the statement that a poem is making. So, what does Ronnie do? He does what is he criticizes the Brooks way of connecting the poems into paradox. Okay, paradox, the way he is making these poems to paradox. He argues it in an article. This Ronnie writes here the article in the colonization that the language of paradox reconsiders. Okay, so he argues in an article, he argue करता है कि जो colonization है वो जो poem है उसका the language of paradox reconsider. उसका article का क्या नाम था? His article's name was the language of paradox reconsidered. Okay, it was written in 1956. There he argued that Brooks failed to read the poem purely for its aesthetic unity, but with a regard to that reader's emotional response to the poem. He writes that what he writes is exactly this: the function of the colonization is primarily non-instrumental. No matter what its meaning is, its end is obviously that it is to be read with delight and for the delighted. Okay, Ronnie is criticizing Brooks' work of his paradoxical work on the poem of the colonization in his writing The Language of Paradox Reconsidered 1956. He says that Brooks has failed to read the poem purely. Okay, he just has read this poem in regards to write it about paradox. He says that he writes that the function of the colonization is primarily non-instrumental. Okay, no matter what the meaning is, its end is obviously that it has to read with delight. The paradox functions primarily for the sake of the total verbal structure of which it is a part and which has its own end in bringing a poem, a beautiful speech. Thus, Ronnie argues against the possibility of paradox as a means to represent the whole of the poem. Okay, that was the last thing on which the Brooks has written in this language of paradox. Here we came to an end of the poem, end of this critical writing of language of paradox. I want to say is this writing is a part of new criticism. Okay, new criticism is what when a writer criticizes okay, क्रिटिसिज्म इज़ नॉट ओनली इन नेगेटिव सेंस. क्रिटिसिज्म हम लोग सिर्फ किसी को क्रिटिसाइज़ करना इसका मतलब ये नहीं होता कि हम लोग उसके बारे में सिर्फ बुरा ही बोले. हाँ मतलब इट्स नॉट एग्जैक्टली इट्स नॉट ओनली अबाउट नेगेटिव थिंग्स, इट्स ऑल्सो पॉजिटिव थिंग्स. ओके, न्यू क्रिटिसिज्म इज बोथ पॉजिटिव प्लस नेगेटिव. इट्स द कॉमेंट्स गिवन इन वन थिंग. And here new critics used to comment upon the poet, and mainly works are written on the negative comments. There are positive comments too, but do not only understand that criticism means only negative points. Okay, there are many things in criticism. Let's make it in the next video. Okay, just remember that this language of paradox is written on the basis of new criticism. Goodbye, guys.